Welcome to the Mockingcast, the podcast of Mockingbird Ministries. I'm David Zoll, your host, and in just a few moments, I'll be joined by my co-hosts, Sarah Condon and RJ Heyman. We come to you every other Friday to explore a few of the places where we currently see grace and its absence playing out in unexpected and compelling ways. We're glad to have you with us.
Praise the Lord. Praise the Lord.
All right, we're back. Here we are on the Mockingcast, another week. We're into June, and it's the last day of school here in Virginia, but I believe one of us is calling in from out of the country, and it's not Sarah.
No, I'm home now. I'm in between.
Oh.
I'm in between trips. So we got home last night. I am broadcasting from sunny and humid Houston, Texas. I'm feeling chill. It's nice. It's a nice feeling.
What is it, from the sublime to the beautiful? What's the phrase?
The sublime to the ridiculous?
From the sublime to the ridiculous,
yeah.
Or from the ridiculous to the sublime. Here we go. Our first piece was forwarded to me by Sarah. Cleve Woodson in the Washington Post wrote an article about a obituary that's gone viral this past week. It's the obituary for Kathleen Demlow, and I have a feeling it was not self-penned. This is how it reads. Kathleen Demlow was born on March 19, 1938, to Joseph and Gertrude Shunk of Wabasso. She married Dennis Demlow in 1957 and had two children, Gina and Jay. In 1962, she became pregnant by her husband's brother, Lyle, and moved to California. She abandoned her children, Gina and Jay, who were then raised by her parents. She passed away on May 31st, 2008, and will now face judgment. She will not be missed by Gina and Jay, and they understand that this world is a better place without her. This was just gone viral naturally because usually obituaries are times when people, put the best face they can on the person who's died, even if they don't really love them. The Washington Post interviewed actually a woman who's an obituary specialist, and she said, people don't generally speak ill of the dead. Susan Soper is her name. In fact, sometimes they will put the best possible face on a person in the obituary and overlook whatever the misdeeds or characteristics that might be unpleasant. But not always. And then she goes on to write about the family of Leslie Popeye Charping of Galveston, Texas. His family was similarly elated at his passing last year. They wrote in his obituary, Leslie's hobbies included being abusive to his family, expediting trips to heaven for the beloved family pets, and fishing. With Leslie's passing, he will be missed only for what he never did, being a loving husband, father, and good friend. Oh, so that's a great. Thanks, Sarah, for bringing
but it's like my favorite Venn diagram, right? It's like completely devastatingly sad and horrible, and also totally hilarious. I mean, it's like the best. It's like the best two things. I mean, those are my favorite things because it is super, super sad that this is like the legacy that these people have left, and that they've obviously like wounded, their children usually, right? Usually it seems like this is a parent to child kind of thing that we see. And then also like, it's funny to think about what a real obituary looks like. And, funny to think about what would be said, about any of us, by any number of people that we love, in an honest way. So, yeah, I mean, it's funny. This got posted in a group I'm a part of that's like very, very focused on grace theology, and people had lots of different responses, but mostly people were really sad, and I kind of felt like I had to filter how funny I thought it was because it is. I don't know. There's something funny about it. Plus, like the picture of her that they chose, she just looks like someone snapped. Like you always have like, right, you'll see these women who are, they died at 92 and there's this like picture of them as like a 25-year-old bombshell, and like poor old Kathleen, man, that did not happen to her. They got like the most confused looking photograph of Kathleen and slapped it in the newspaper. So, and it's, I guess it's relevant to our lives right now. My father-in-law passed away 2 weeks ago, and we have a complicated family, like a lot of people have complicated families, and there has not been an obituary. So it was interesting to sort of have this pop up.
Yeah, well, I mean, I know that that's been happening in your family, Sarah. So who was responsible for writing the obituary?
That's always the interesting question. So in my family of origin, my dad always writes the obituaries because he's the writer in the family. But my husband's family doesn't have the built-in writer system. So what has ended up happening is that my husband wrote this completely beautiful sort of memory of his dad as the church newsletter this past week. And we had an old picture of him from the 70s with his dad at Easter, and he put it up there. And, you know, I mean, he said to me later, it would have been weird for dad to have been on the internet. That was not like, his dad was not the kind of guy that would have wanted that. But it's given us a way to kind of process it out loud. And, you know, it's not bad for a church for the pastor to be like, hey, families are complicated, ours too. So, you know, I think that's its own gift.
RJ, what do you think?
Made me think about a couple things. One is just that families are complicated. There are people who are not nice out there. You know, I have a good friend who's, I think her grandfather's first wife passed away, and then grandfather got remarried to a woman that was just really, really awful to my friend and to her siblings, and would force them to sit quietly and wouldn't let them sleep in beds, made them sleep on floors, and was just really awful to visit. I mean, it did make me wonder, reading this obituary, whether this woman's California family wrote a separate obituary, you know, whether that pregnancy ended up sort of resulting in a child, and whether there was a second obituary written by the second family out in California. So just a reminder that, as you said, Sarah, families can be very complicated, and sometimes people can just be mean, you know. And at the same time, made me think of a funeral I did a little while back where the man who had died had probably not been the best father to his children, and had taken off and spent some time kind of traveling the world and not being terribly present. And I think also probably struggled with some addiction issues. But I talked to his son, who gave the remarks at his funeral, and he said, you know, RJ, the funny thing is, like, yes, it's true. Like, my father maybe wasn't all that he could have been, but as soon as he passed, he's like, I have no bitterness. He's like, I'm remembering like the good times we spent together, and I feel like I've forgiven him. And I thought that was a pretty amazing, beautiful thing, that God had, you know, in his grace, allowed this son to forgive his father, and yet also to carry this good news, because his father, I think, was a man of faith despite his many failings, to say, you know, this is not the end of your relationship. You know, you guys are going to see each other again, and maybe those things that you weren't able to say or didn't get a chance to hear, or the resolution that you might want that you didn't get, that there will be another chance to do that, you know. And apart from some kind of, you know, hopeful message about the afterlife, it is sad to think how much regret and pain there is out there.
Golly, you guys have like serious thoughts about this. What it reminded me of was of that obituary that appeared a couple of years ago that I think we wrote about, you know, in 2012. Val Patterson, a scientist from Salt Lake City, who used his obituary to like get a bunch of things off his chest.
Oh,
like,
yeah.
He like wrote to that hotel and was like, by the way, I was the one who stole the safe out of room 203. And then he said he said that he didn't have a doctorate in engineering, that he hadn't even graduated from college. And this is from the obituary. He said, what happened was that the day I went to pay off my college student loan at the University of Utah, the girl working there put my receipt into the wrong stack, and 2 weeks later, a PhD diploma came in the mail. I didn't even graduate. I had only about 3 years of college credit. In fact, I never did even learn what the letters PhD even stood for. For all the electronic engineers I've worked with, I'm sorry, but you have to admit my designs always worked well, and I always made you laugh at work. So
it's awesome.
That's where my mind went, guys.
Crazy.
But I also, you know, Sarah, I'm like you. I read that and I immediately sort of guffawed, because you're just not expecting it when that third paragraph about Catherine Demwell is like, she became pregnant by her husband's brother, Lyle, and then moved to California. It's just not, when you see the picture of kind of like, even if she's confused, she still looks like
an old lady,
a quaint grandma type.
Right.
And you forget, you know, as much as we think we're probably an ageist society and we overvalue youth and we disrespect our elders and all that stuff, we also have this understanding, like we see someone who's old and we presume that they haven't lived a life full of complication and dysfunction and sin. In fact, you know, I can tell you stories from my own family. But, this is, of course, this also made us think this week of, the news, the shocking news about Kate Spade. I know when I was at my college, the girls in our sort of circle, Kate Spade was definitely a status thing, whether or not you had a Kate Spade bag. And then there were shops everywhere. And I feel like maybe her brand had lost its luster in recent years, but she's so iconic. And what did this affect you guys? Because she did commit suicide in a pretty dramatic way. I think she hung herself by a scarf.
Yeah. It's actually strangely really affected us because Jamie, my wife, knew her because our kids went to preschool together in New York City.
You guys.
Yeah.
It's awful.
Yeah. And it seems kind of strange because, we haven't, that was what now? I don't know, 9 or 10 years ago or something, but Jamie just remembers her always being like very sweet and very down to earth at kind of this, pretty upper crusty, like, Upper East Side preschool. Our kids are the same age. So we have a 13-year-old, she has a 13-year-old, just thinking through, my gosh, what must that be like for her daughter? And then I sort of said to Jamie last night, I said, why is this hitting you so hard? I said, is this maybe the closest suicide you have to you in terms of your like life experience and your age? And she's been texting with a bunch of her friends in New York who also knew her. There's sort of a little, text group of other parents from that preschool. But Jamie said, yeah. She said, it just, it really hits home. And she said, I don't know, being a mom is hard. Being a mom, no matter what Kate was dealing with, I guess she had some depression, she had some anxiety, but like life is hard. Being a mom is hard, but it has hit us a little bit actually the last 3-4 days. And it's been kind of sad, but also, created some introspection, I guess.
Yeah. Hearing about kind of the fashion climate that she came of age in, when we think about the Kate Moss kind of heroin chic minimalist stuff. And Kate comes on the scene and there's like color and life and vibrancy and beauty. And, there's been some critiques I've seen, especially from the left, where people have said, we're making too big a deal of this. And like, this is such a classist issue because no one, so many people couldn't afford Kate Spade. And I actually never owned a Kate Spade purse. I just don't spend a lot of money on purses, but I'm so grateful for her because like if you walk into a Target today and you pick out a navy swimsuit and it has like a really cute pattern, with flamingos on it and it's kind of preppy, that's Kate Spade. She has influenced so much of what we've seen come out of American fashion at every level that people could buy it at. And so she was an incredible creative force. And this is just such a terrible way to lose her.
Yeah, gosh, this is such an epidemic, and I'm tired of talking about it too. In a way, Sarah, you feel sheepish about another week, another extremely successul person who everyone is sort of jealous of from a distance, is in quiet, in enormous amounts of despair and unaddressed mental illness or addressed mental illness and just anguish. And I don't know. It's absolutely heartbreaking. It's been the story of our year here, and it's only going to continue. So it makes me, not to downplay this incident, I feel for her daughter, of course. There's no real easy way to transition from that to the next thing. So I'll just jump in. This long essay that actually Will wrote about last week from John Baskin in The Point, which is what he calls one of these little magazines that was sort of McSweeney's or N+1. And it's a magazine that's called Tired of Winning. And this is a guy, Baskin, he'd worked for a a liberal think tank in Washington and talks about that experience and then moves into sort of what it says more largely about the interplay between intellectual pursuit and political advocacy, because it feels to me, as someone who's been reading this stuff and spends probably too much time reading this stuff, is that the two have become intertwined to some would say exciting extent, some would say boring or a tiresome extent. I'd be on the second side of that. But this is what he writes. He said, what was held to be paramount at the Center for American Progress, that's the think tank, was to quote unquote win the narrative of the daily political news cycle. This required little academic investigation or insight. It did demand, however, an education in a certain kind of rhetoric. The paragraph, the sentence, even the individual word revealed themselves as potential foot soldiers in the battle for public opinion and political power. There was no other goal besides winning. To be progressive at the Center for American Progress was to be on the side of reality. It was also to believe reality was on one side. This was very convenient. It meant that there were no questions, only answers. Or you might say only questions of strategy, but not substance. And so he leaves Washington and he talks about going to New York because he wants to get involved in real intellectual debates where the intellectuals are not the captives of the legislators. And he starts working for a couple of these small magazines, all very left-leaning. And he says, we were not merely going to report on progress, we were going to make it. It was exhilarating to try and live this way. It invested what might seem like trivial everyday decisions with world historical import. Eventually, though, I began to notice in myself a tension that also existed at the heart of our project. My aesthetic and cultural taste did not always or often match the direction the magazines were trying to take me politically. This had not troubled me before because I'd never considered that, quote, everything is in the last analysis political. That's the mantra that we hear these days from Frederick Jameson. But now I had come to see that politics were not just an activity people engaged in at certain times. It was something that infused every aspect of one's experience, from which big box store you shopped at for your year's supply of toilet paper, to what restaurants you chose to eat at, to who you chose to sleep with. This was what it meant to, quote, have a politics. That everything I did ought to be disciplined by my politics. But what if it wasn't? Should I then revise my politics or myself? Now, that's the great question. And when Will talked about it, he talked about how political ideologies have this totalizing effect on us, and they sort of claim to explain absolutely everything, which that quote, sort of that mantra refers to. And yet you run into the perennial problem that anyone who's religious has, of course, run into many times. Is like there's the way the world should be, and these convictions I say that I espouse, and then there's the way the world actually is, and who I actually am, and how do we resolve that tension? And if you're working in a system, or if you're married to a system that is really only about discerning right from wrong and doesn't, like, at least Christianity has a forgiveness theoretically, as a part of the ingredient. And it, to be a Christian is to be often tortured over this gap between what ought to be and what is. And so if there's no even default back to mercy, then how do you live? And it's the great question. Do you revise your politics or yourself? Do you revise your religion or do you revise yourself? There's more to say about it, but I thought I'd get y'all's thoughts before y'all. I can't believe I just said y'all. I thought I'd get your thoughts before I moved on.
No, I guess this is a very now specific reaction, but having been kind of off the grid for about 10 days and coming back into this, it suddenly makes me realize why people decide to just go on sort of fast from media, because I hear the article was great and I heard what he was saying, and yet it also just made me anxious and sad and the winning the debate. And I remember when Center for American Progress started, it was kind of a big deal, because there was the Heritage Foundation and all these kind of right-leaning think tanks that seemed to be quote unquote winning, and Podesta, and everyone was going to start this new think tank that was going to have this profound impact. And I think, to some degree it did on the Obama presidency. But even when we were on vacation, my son asked me, because we were listening to music from the 80s and the 90s, and the kids were asking, what were the 80s like? What were the 90s like? And they were like, what are people going to say the 2010s were like? And I said, I think people are going to talk about the incredible jarring juxtaposition between Barack Obama and Donald Trump. Can you imagine sort of two more dissimilar presidents, and yet that's it's an example for me of what seems to be true, that just so much of American political life is just one reaction after another. It's reaction against the reaction against the reaction against the reaction. And as he says, there's so little time for thinking, for relationship development, for encountering people who are different from you, for encountering people who are similar from you in some ways and different from you in others. But I admire the article. I admired his desire, and I guess what led to him founding The Point, having a place where people could actually just sort of say what they were thinking and not fit into one little box. But again, those aren't the loudest voices in our culture. It's kind of Fox News versus, MSNBC or something like that. But again, coming back after vacation, it's like, do I want to re-engage with this stuff? Like maybe
Sure.
I don't. Do I have a choice whether or not to? Because it's so all-encompassing. But yeah, it was a heavy article.
I feel like in life, every time I try to define myself by something, especially if it's like an ultimate goal of righteousness, I'm so quickly reminded that I'm going to fall short of that, and that that's not where my identity is. And it's always jarring. But I mean, even like yesterday, I was talking to a colleague of mine about hospitals, and she was like, "Do you like hospitals?" And I was like, I love going to hospitals. I love visiting people at hospitals. Like, it's my whole pastoral presence, and I'm like really good at it. And I'm such a giver. And then today, like, I rolled up to do hospitals, and it's like 450 degrees outside. I get to the first place, which I drive 25 minutes to, angry the whole time. And the guy's in some sort of, patient's in some sort of therapy that I can't get to. So great. Okay, right. So then I get in my car mad, and then I drive to this other hospital where I can't find any parking, so I can't see these people. And I'm like, all I could think about is the conversation I had the day before where I had defined myself as like the Oprah of hospital visits. So I don't know what people do. Like, I literally don't know how you survive when your whole identity is bound up in a political affiliation, because this is just hospital visits. You know what I mean? Like, to have those choices that you have to make all the time, constantly. Like, we were in our neighborhood this past week. My son finished school, and they do this thing in the neighborhood where all the fifth graders, because he's at the neighborhood school, all the fifth graders parade down the street, and all the kids throw water balloons at them. And it turns into this like giant water balloon fight between the dads. And it lasts for like 45 minutes. And they do the water balloons. I don't know if your kids have done these, but they're the ones you just put in the hose, right?
Yeah,
and so you can make 100 water balloons in like 5 minutes. So it's so like there's these like shards of water balloons everywhere. And I'm like, you know, we live in a more conservative area, and, you know, I don't know. And there's all sorts of baggage that can come with that for people or whatever. I grew up in Mississippi. I'm sort of used to it, but I was with this mom, and she just looked down at all the balloons, like shards, like everywhere, all over everyone's, like for just a whole street. And she goes, "Well, the kids had fun, but this is an environmental nightmare." And I was like, I love that you just like name the reality of like what this is. And then we're just going to have to move on from it, right? Because we can't meet that law. And so I don't know how people survive when they're constantly like, you know, I mean, you talk about the big box thing. Obviously, that's a conversation between Walmart and Costco, right? Well, Costco pays fair wages, Costco this, Costco that, Costco this, Costco that. And I have plenty of people I know who are Democrats who are like, mourn every time they have to go into Sam's Club, you know? And I'm like, that's exhaustive. So I don't know.
This phrase, though, what's your politics? You know, I never have.
Right.
This is the kind of I have a politics. It really is a way of talking about. It's a code that everything I do is consistent.
It's a religious question,
right? It's a religious question, and it's not only. I mean, and he talks about how one intellectual argument was the assistant to the legislator in D.C., and now it's become the willing tool of the activist. And anytime sort of some ideas become the instrument of one particular end, even if it's religious, you know, they cease to really be ideas. He says, in attempting to discipline our desires to our political convictions, we might allow our ideology to overrun our intellect. You know, you think that, that is exactly what's going on. And then he says, when everything is political, everything is threatened by the tendency of the political to reduce thinking to positioning. In other words, everything becomes every word I utter, every action I undertake, every email I send becomes a self-justification or a justification according to this politics I say I espouse. And anything that doesn't fit it, I have to hide. But the ultimate thing he says is he's endorsing a conversation. I really like this guy's perspective about modern life that includes, but is not limited to, political convictions. Some things we believe are in the last analysis poetic, some spiritual, some psychological, some moral. Now, that is an extremely subversive thing to say, especially in the space in which he's saying it. To say that, no, not actually everything is ultimately a political question. In fact, we believe in a spiritual reality. We believe that God is above and before and beyond and all of these things. And to put all of our hope in political processes, it doesn't mean that we don't put any hope in them, but to put all of our hope is is tantamount to a denial that there are any other factors at work. And I see it as a cult of despair. Ultimately, it's a lot of what's going on. So that's what drew me to the piece. So, RJ, you were about to say something?
I just thought what you read, you know, our ideology trumps our, what was it? Ideology trumps?
Overruns our intellect.
Intellect, exactly. He's basically what he's saying about his own particular, in this case, left-leaning paradigm is exactly what people accuse the church of all the time, right? In order to become a Christian, you have to check your brain at the door, right? Yeah. That your ideology overcomes your intellect. And he's saying, no, actually, that's true of the most intellectual possible space you can imagine. These very elitist, left-leaning magazines. That's exactly what he had to do, to check his brain at the door in order to meet the incredibly stringent demands of that particular religious space. Mm-hmm. And what it also made me think, and not to be too Christian about it, is that this is one of the huge benefits of belonging to a church. That in general, I'm sure this isn't 100% true, but I have found, no matter how homogenous a church seems to be from the outside, when you actually get into a church, you're going to meet a lot of people who disagree with you, who are different than you, who think differently than you, who have different politics than you do. And it's not, I think most people imagine church to be a total echo chamber where everyone agrees about everything. And that is just totally not the case at all. And it forces you to bump up against people who are not like you. As he says in there, he works for these left-leaning magazines that claim to speak for the proletariat, and yet none of those people had any, none of the writers had any contact with the proletariat whatsoever.
Or they'd had to escape the proletariat in order to write for these magazines.
Exactly. And they're also writing magazines that nobody from that particular, social class are ever going to read or engage with. And it does remind me, if I talked about this before, this amazing book, written by a Berkeley sociologist called, I can't remember, Strangers in Their Own Land, where this Berkeley sociologist goes and lives in kind of Louisiana, in some polluted parts of Louisiana for 5 years, getting to know Tea Party and Trump
where my
voters.
people are from.
Well, exactly. I hate to say, but yes, exactly. But it's
like Louisiana.
And I didn't say that. Those are your words, not mine, Sarah. Don't hate. No, but she talks about sort of scaling the empathy wall, and actually listening to people and talking to them and realizing that their political convictions and the way they see the world is not totally insane. Like, they have reasons for thinking the way that they do, and they have been abused by government, things like that. Like, there's a reason they're not pro-government. And so, people that people that on a certain side of the political spectrum look at and say, oh, those people are crazy. They're not crazy, and there needs to be a little bit more sympathy and empathy and talking and relationships.
And smelling, RJ.
Smelling.
I just think it's all drugs, though, right? Like, I think this is all drugs. I think this is just like the drug that people are on, and it's like their political drug, and that's like what makes them feel good, what helps them make decisions. It's like an acceptable, like, politics right now, especially being really dogmatic, it's like an acceptable addiction, right? Like, you can wreck your life for it. You make life choices. You can alienate family members for it, right? Because it's politics. Like, there's a guy I'm friends with through social media who's a pastor. His name's Ryan Couch. And the other day he wrote,
oh my gosh.
Self-righteousness. Do you know Ryan?
No. I saw what you posted.
It's so good. Self-righteousness is a hallucinogenic. And I was like, yes, that is so true. Like, I don't exactly know what a hallucinogenic feels like, but I do know what an epidural feels like. And
did you go to school in Santa Fe? I find it hard to believe.
You got to start reading some
I read the Bible
a
lot when I was at school in Santa Fe. But yeah, no, it's very powerful. Like, it's a drug. It's just an acceptable drug.
Yeah, for like a week. For a week, it's really fun to be in a room with people who all agree with you and affirm you until you realize that you actually don't agree about everything.
Yeah.
And for a week, it's really fun until it becomes incredibly depressing and scary.
And people start you start to find inner rings within the inner ring. But this is actually, this week, the reason we brought this up, it's kind of an abstract conversation, is that Elizabeth Brunig, once again, writing something amazing for the Washington Post. She says, we are no longer capable of forgiving our enemies. And by that, she's talking about what happened with Roseanne Barr, her racist tweet, and then Samantha Bee saying obscenity about Ivanka Trump. And she talks about this being sort of the moment, people who are upset that Roseanne got fired. Then they're looking for someone on the left to vilify, and Samantha Bee presents herself very willingly, it looks like. And it's this cycle of provocation and vindication, of provocation, retribution. She says that that's bad news for societies because they're undoubtedly bad lessons in civic virtue, especially if we still purport to be something like a liberal democracy whose key tenet is tolerance, a tough asset to claim if you're perpetually scanning the horizon for things to be disruptively furious about. But they're worse than that, this sort of cycle. They are terrible moral lessons, and they make us into bad people. And this is what she says. If forgiveness had a face, it would be hideous. It would be hideous to us now. We wouldn't be able to look at forgiveness without revulsion, because forgiveness means having the technical right to exact some penalty, but electing not to pursue it. This breaks the cycle of retribution with unearned, undeserved mercy. The face of forgiveness is bruised because it bears its own injuries with grace. So doing permits the cycle of retribution to go no further. It is a hard thing, but necessary if huge numbers of strangers are going to live together peacefully. It's the total absence of forgiveness from our cultural logic that makes any penalties whatsoever feel terminal. Ask yourself, what would it take for you to forgive whichever of these two women who has offended you more? Not just to ignore them or release them into the icy waters of vague contempt, but to wish them well or well enough and perhaps one day give them the chance to make you laugh. If forgiveness had a face, we would find it hideous. That is poetic and
oh my gosh,
unbelievably profound, I think. And it cuts to the core because, I have my own ideological others and maybe they have Christian faces or it's sectarian stuff or it's, we're all whatever identities that we're caught up in. We have what I'm trying to say is that it convicts me as a sinful person who's who hasn't taken a vacation this last week and is caught up in the narratives and trying to win them, and maybe to win them for Mockingbird or win them for Grace. I don't know what it is, but it is certainly forgiveness. The face of forgiveness is bruised because it bears its own injuries with grace. Let's put out a bumper sticker of that, guys. And
it's so good.
Put it on our foreheads.
It's so Jesus-y. It's so good. Yeah. So I keep thinking about, I had therapy today and we were talking about like when you yell at your kids, like, or,
I
whatever.
have no idea what you're talking about.
Wave your arms
Sarah.
in the air or make yourself really big. This is something I do is if my son is not moving fast enough, I'll kind of chase him up the stairs, which is not nice. And in therapy, she has told me that sometimes when we do things to other people, but in this case to our children, we just want to be like, oh, I'm sorry, and then move on. And really that then makes the whole thing still about us, right? It's like that we've said we're sorry. And she said actually what you need to say is, how did it make you feel? Because that's what people are actually looking for in that moment is like, how did this make you feel? And if you ask my 7-year-old, how does it make you feel when mama chases you upstairs? He's like, really scary because you're big. And I'm like, oh. So I think if we were to ask people from the Roseanne perspective, honestly, I find both of these things, you can't even say what Samantha Bee said, but both of these things are pretty horrible. I think if I were to say, how did it make me feel? It makes me feel like disgusting. And it makes me feel sort of disgust in general and probably really just disgust at myself, right? Disgust that, I'm 2 beers away from saying something awful, like disgust that, that this is actually base reality of human nature. And I think that's why when these things happen, it is this inclination we have to just shut them off, to shut it away because we don't want to look at it and we don't want to look at that part of ourselves. And we don't want to look at people we've hurt and say, well, how did that make you feel? So.
Yeah, we're not a forgiving culture. I was just thinking about this. We do forget things. I think about, sorry to bring sports up, but Kobe Bryant, the sort of Hall of Fame guard for the Los Angeles Lakers who won an Oscar last year. Remember that? Well, you guys didn't watch the Oscars. I watched the Oscars. He won an Oscar for a short feature animated film that he was involved in. Huh. But do you remember what he did like 10 years ago in Colorado? Uh-huh. You don't remember because you don't know. I don't really, I mean, he probably raped someone in Colorado.
Oh, right.
I
remember this. Yeah,
remember
yeah.
that?
Mm-hmm.
And there was a whole big trial, went on for months and months and months and months.
Yeah.
But nobody talks about that 10 years later. And I don't know if he's been forgiven. I think it's been forgotten. And I can pretty much guarantee that in a year or two, no one's really going to remember Samantha Bee or Roseanne Barr and what happened. And again, and then the other thing I thought, the title of this article, we are no longer capable of forgiving our enemies. And the enemies thing is really important because we will forgive our friends of anything. We will forgive our favorite politicians of anything. There was that, that I didn't watch it, but I heard really uncomfortable Bill Clinton interview this week on. Did you watch it? It was terrible, right?
No, I didn't watch it, but I mean, I've heard the stuff. But he's the best example for this, right? I mean, I come from Southern Democrats.
Now people want to get after him because we're in the middle of the Me Too movement and because Trump is president. But 20 years ago, man, Democrats were making every possible excuse about the division between private and public life, and it's just the exact same thing where, you'll forgive your friends and anything. You'll impute righteousness to them, but people you don't like, and you won't forgive anything. And then also, I always wonder, how is it that couples, people that are married or people that are friends can so quickly go from being in love to just totally hating each other? And it just, again, I hate to harp on this, but I feel like this has been an insight for me recently. It just all, again, comes down to imputation. If you love someone and they're your friend and you're on their side, you will forgive them of anything. But once you sort of cross that border, once you turn that corner, everything's out the window and nothing is forgivable and everything is wrong. And we can make that switch pretty quickly. People can make that switch between love and hate incredibly quickly. So anyway, I think we're not a forgiving culture. We are a forgetful culture, I think.
Yeah, and you also wonder it's a brilliant title, but we've never been capable of forgiving our enemies. And this is why it's so unfashionable to say that the sinner is actually the enemy of God. In rebellion, and we want to say no, we're just sick, or no, we're just just
basically on God's side,
dysfunctional. And those things are true. That there is sickness to it, but to be rebellious and to make God your enemy is a different story. And yet, the gospel here is that God actually forgives us as enemies, not just making us whole, not just reconciling him to lost children, but to forgive one's enemies, that which we cannot do, and that which convicts us as I wish it might not just be in my nature, unfortunately, to forgive this person that I really feel is my enemy. I know I should, but I can't. And my hope, my ultimate existential, spiritual, religious, deep hope of my soul is that God can and has and will forgive me as an enemy of the cross, as the one who put him there, not just the one who stood by and let it happen, but the one, it's that great Mark Mattis or Stephen Paulson line. I forget who did it at Mockingbird. It's like, did you make a decision for Christ? And he said, yes, I made a decision to drive the nail through his hand. Right. And that sounds so dark. Right. And yet, if we're in a world in which we are making enemies of people that we cannot forgive, and that means that we are someone else's enemy that will not forgive us, then it's actually tremendously hopeful. Mm-hmm. It's tremendously hopeful because it means that God came to forgive not just his friends, but his enemies. And we are all that. And it reminded me ultimately of this final thing. We just wanted to talk briefly about Alan Jacobs' talk from the conference, which was so powerful and germane, and it's called Seeds of Renewal, and we were able to post a bit of it on the site. And he talks about our need to draw these boundaries and to turn people into ideological puppets for our own self-justification. And what he does is he looks at the transfiguration of what happens immediately after the transfiguration as the leader of the disciples. Peter gets excited about being on the mountain and wants to stay there. Then he takes Jesus aside and rebukes him. Then they argue about which of the disciples is the coolest and the best. Then they don't understand his talk about death. They're afraid to ask him what he means. Then they get really mad when they see someone else is healing people in Jesus' name and want to stop that bad person. They also get really mad when people in a town won't listen to Jesus and want to call down fire from heaven and blast these chumps to cinders, because isn't that what prophets do? And we're like way better than Elijah, right? So basically, Jesus has chosen as his followers a bunch of 7-year-olds. He wants them to preach, heal, and embrace patiently the suffering that accompanies following him. They, by contrast, want to be victorious, receive praise, and smack down people they feel disrespect them or want to muscle in on their territory. As my friend Freddie DeBoer says these days, everyone's a cop. He says, I think the characteristic sin of our moment, this is Jacob's, is not anything sexual, but wrath. Wrath is the characteristic sin of our age. And the 12 exemplify that. Rather than doing what they're told to do, which requires being loving toward others and the conquest of their own fear and pride, they are continually attentive to what they think everyone else is doing wrong, whether it's ignoring Jesus or following him from the wrong social location. This is a problem throughout the Gospels. The disciples and lookers-on alike are far more interested in other people and what God is going to do to those other people than the state of their own souls. People ask Jesus whether many will be saved or only a few, and he responds, why don't you work on entering through that narrow gate? They ask whether those people at the Tower of Siloam fell on were especially bad sinners, and he says, they're no worse than you. When Jesus tells Peter how he will die, Peter says, well, okay, but what about John? To which Jesus replies, what is that to you? How is that any of your business? And then to cover the whole general phenomenon, Jesus asks, why are you worried about the specks in other people's eyes when you have logs in your own? The answer is clear. We really and truly believe that we're the ones with the specks and they're the ones with the log. We're hallucinating, to quote Sarah's friend. But Jesus tells us otherwise. Why don't we try believing him and see how that works? Because it sucks. It doesn't feel good.
It doesn't feel good. I don't want to know how you feel. I don't care how I've hurt you. Yeah, it's always like, I just wonder what would happen, if we were in the middle. We've this past year, and gosh, Dave, you've seen this more than we have, but just these horrible protests, and people from both sides there, and there's violence, and there's fear, and there's guns, and and just like, what would it look like if I feel like this is such like an idealistic thing to say, but like, what would it look like if we showed up and we remembered that we were the sinners? Like, what would it look like if we showed up to do this kind of work? And a lot of this is like good gospel justice work that people are doing. What would it look like if we remembered we were sinners when we were doing it? Because I think we just, it's like, it is. That should be the title of this episode. Like, self-righteousness is a hallucinogen. But it's like, you really, once you step into that space, only God can embody the law and the graciousness. Like, only God can. It's so hard for us to do it. And we live in a time where there's so much law, and it's just so tempting to step into it and to be dogmatic and to claim the other people as the ones who are wrong. And I just don't, I wonder if the human soul is even capable of holding both of those ideals at the same time. Does that make any sense? I don't know. It
does. And at the same time, it's so, it's incredibly comforting and reassuring when you hear someone who actually sort of wants to tell the truth and wants to engage people as people. I don't know how our listeners feel about like This American Life and Ira Glass. Like, clearly he's more on the left side of the spectrum, but I do feel like one of his geniuses is that he actually listens to people.
Yeah.
And he hears what they has to say, and he sort of not expects the best of them, but he, imputes righteousness to them. He treats them as better than they are, and he's curious. He's curious about where they come from and how they got to be there. And when you hear that, it just feels different. It's not the it's not the sort of momentary endorphin rush of finding someone who agrees with everything that you have to say, which then also has a crash. There's the ascent and the crash of self-loathing at the end, but it just feels good. And it's a lot more likely to make you cry, and make you a better spouse and a better parent and a better friend. So maybe that's the thing, is just to dwell on those voices in our culture that are more gracious and not more self-justifying.
Amen to that.
Like you, Dave.
2 beers, man, it's all over. All the nice guy stuff. Or a pizza.
For me, it's a pizza.
That's more Dave style. Right. Just a lot of carbs, and all the truth comes out.
Carb them up, baby.
Shush. No, well, this is maybe one of the many reasons why I go to church every week, to hear about a gracious God. But I do look forward to hearing from you guys again soon. We'll see you in a couple weeks, right?
In a couple weeks.
Okay. Arrivederci.
Bye.
Thank you for listening. Remember, you can find us on the web at www.mbird.com. And we'd always love to hear from you at info@mbird.com. Audio production for the Mockingcast is provided by the Narrativo Group, and if you like what you've heard, please do drop over to iTunes and leave us a rating and review. Until next time.
Praise the Lord.